On today's podcast, we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We started last week talking a little bit about the myths or some of the misconceptions as it relates to cash flows in our businesses. Today I'm going to pick up on that, and I'm going to focus really just in two reasons as it relates to our accounts receivable and how it affects our cash flow. Of course, our businesses are all driven by our revenue, by our sales, by essentially what we sell, regardless if we're selling widgets, if we're selling some sort of a product, if we're selling real estate, if we are selling a service. As I own an accounting firm, and of course, our revenue is driven by the work that we perform. Most of our clients are in the real estate space, and of course, much of the sales are driven. They may buy and fix and sell a property. Others they may just simply wholesale, and others may rent a property. And so revenue can come in from many different areas. But of course, our businesses are driven by our sales. And in order for our business to survive, as we talked a little bit about last week, cash flow is essential. I mean, this is kind of a no-brainer, right? I have to have cash coming in. I have to have the cash to be able to pay my bills, to pay my lenders, to essentially keep my business above water. Okay, and cash flow is basic arithmetic. Okay, so of course we talked about last week a lot of misconceptions, a lot of misunderstanding as it relates to cash flow. People think that I have cash flow because I have money in the bank. Okay, and that's not necessarily true. Okay, we really need to kind of focus on what is our true cash flow. What is the cash flow that belongs to us? Okay, and of course we can go and get a loan, and the money hits our bank account, and we have more cash in the bank, and it creates this emotion like I have some money, and we kind of really don't. So measuring cash flow is basic arithmetic. It's basically looking at what is my cash balance at the end of the month as it relates to the cash balance at the beginning of the month or any sort of period. And of course, I have more cash at the end of the month than I did at the beginning of the month. In theory, I have positive cash flow. But we really kind of need to peel away what is the operational side versus what is cash that belongs to other people to measure what is my true cash flow. If we have positive cash flow, okay, our business should be improving. If we have negative cash flow, we figure our business is probably moving backwards from a health perspective. Okay, and once again, we're talking about the cash flow that truly belongs to us, not the cash flow that belongs to others. Cash flow increasing, cash flow decreasing as it relates to the operational side can be a result of many, many different reasons. But what I'm going to do today is focus on two of those reasons as it relates specifically to accounts receivable. So this is probably maybe a little bit easier to do if I had a marker board behind me and I was maybe graphing this out a little bit. So I know for most of the people that listen to this podcast, you're listening to the audio side. So I'm going to just try to explain this the best that I can. And I am working on the process of writing a book, and I'm going to kind of try to create a little bit more on the visual side once that gets published and that gets out there. But I think you probably find resources out there that can kind of create this visual. So I'm going to try to explain it just by using words and hopefully can in your mind create the visual here. So if you think about the timeline that it takes to collect accounts receivable, and of course most businesses when they go through and they bill, generally they have some sort of a timeline that they expect the client to pay the bill. Okay, as an owner of an accounting firm, we send our invoices out, and most of our invoices are either due on receipt, 15 days or 30 days, depending on the contract we have with our client. Okay, but if you think about the timeline that it takes for your receivables, for example, if your business only has 1 month of cash, okay, but it takes 2 months to collect your receivables, you can see at some point when you take your receivables, you look at your payables. Okay, and if the timeline to collect on your accounts receivable is greater than the timeline of your payables, eventually you're going to run out of cash. Okay, so your cash flow is going to dwindle away. And if it's taken you consistently 60 to 90 days to collect on your receivables, but you're constantly trying to keep your payables up to date, and most of the time our payables are due on a shorter time frame, then we're gonna run into some issues. Okay, so depending on the spread between our accounts receivable timeline and our accounts payable timeline, profit margins and the amount of cash spent that only hits the balance sheet side will determine how long a business can essentially operate. Okay, because we are going to have a lot of cash flow going to be paying down debt. We have cash flow that's going to be that's going out the business. Maybe the owner draws, things of that nature. And so we kind of have to take a look at each of these elements. But bottom line, if we are not keeping on top of our receivables, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of the podcast, if we aren't managing our accounts receivable well, and we aren't taking a look at that frequently, and we aren't managing that, and we aren't managing our payables well, we are going to run into some issues. So number one, the timeline to collect my accounts receivable is greater than the timeline of payables. Taking the other factors into consideration, eventually my business is going to run out of cash. And I'm going to be looking for other places to go to try to bring cash in to keep my business above water. Secondly, similarly, if it takes months longer to collect on receivables than the timeline to produce a product, if we think about a business that has to go through and it has to generate a product, and I don't care if I'm going through and I'm buying real estate, I'm rehabbing real estate, and I'm going to sell real estate, okay, or if I'm creating some sort of a product. Okay, so if I'm going through and I'm taking raw material, I'm developing a product, it's going to take me so long to develop this product. So if it takes months longer to collect on receivables than the timeline to produce a product, the business will be operating at a negative cash flow. So just kind of think about that. Okay, so I'm building up this inventory. It takes me 2 months to develop the inventory, but if it takes me 3, 4, 5, 6 months to collect on the sale of that inventory, and if I'm doing that consistently, eventually, and actually quite quickly, my business will run out of cash. That's why many times especially businesses in the startup phase, they'll go through and they'll get loans against their inventory, which is generally a higher risk loan, higher interest rate, and it can really be a recipe for trouble even in the short term if that is not managed well. So if it takes months longer for a business to collect on receivables than the timeline to produce a product, the business will be operating at a negative cash flow until such time as there is enough margin retained in cash to eliminate the cash deficit. So essentially, we're going to be working through this cycle until I have enough margin in my the difference between what it costs for me to produce that product and I have to consider my overhead and the receivable. What I'm selling the product for, there has to be enough margin there eventually, hopefully, to get us to the point of being caught up and then kind of flip that thing on its head to where we actually have the cash on hand to be able to produce the inventory so we can increase our cash flow. As I mentioned, some companies will resort to obtaining inventory loans to cover the spread, but this does lengthen the time that it will take for the business to have a positive operating cash flow position. So I know that was kind of a little bit meaty there and hopefully not overly confusing, but hopefully try to create that visual as to the cash flow and what's going on as it relates to your receivables, your payables, and then some of the costs that are related to producing your product or service. So for a business to start and remain in a positive operating cash flow position, managing its receivables is essential. So increasing cash flow by making sure invoices are remitted timely. I know in my business, when I was a solopreneur years ago, I just invoiced whenever. I didn't really much worry about it. Now that I have an actual functioning business, I have employees, I have a lot more overhead. I have to make sure that my invoices are getting out timely and I'm staying on top of it. In my business, I don't do my billing, but if a client hasn't paid, I'm going to be the one that's going to be reaching out and making that phone call or shooting that email out, sending those reminders out. As a business owner, we have to stay on top of making sure that our invoices are remitted and that those invoices are paid. So we need to have a process and a person responsible for collecting the receivables. And so if you, the business owner, aren't going to do it, you better have a point person that is going to be making those difficult phone calls. Okay, and making sure that you have that process in place. If someone hasn't paid, what is our process of communication? Staying on top of it. We get lazy on our receivable side, eventually our cash is seriously going to be affected. So I have a process and a person responsible for collecting receivables. We need to also be looking at decreasing our outflow of cash by keeping overhead costs under control, eliminating as much as possible all non-essential expenses, and have a savings plan in place for future investment into the company for growth and health. Okay, so we don't, every time we want to go and expand our business, if we have to go and borrow somebody else's cash, Okay, that's going to really affect our cash flow position. It's going to really lengthen the amount of time it's going to take for our business to become healthy. So making sure that even on the front end that we're looking at having some sort of a plan in place to be investing in the company. So our goal is to get to the point that we're never using debt, such as credit cards or unsecured lines of credit, to help our business stay in a positive cash flow position overall. Hopefully this podcast did bring you some value. I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the Belk on Business podcast. Have a wonderful day.